Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 49. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 95 and 96 of the Prima Pars, that is, of things pertaining to the first man's will, namely grace and righteousness, and of the mastership belonging to man in the state of innocence. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether the first man was created in grace. Was man created in a supernatural state by the gift of God at the very beginning? Aquinas will say yes, and argue in the following manner. First, man was made upright, as it is written in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 29, but rectitude consists in the submission of the sensitive faculties to the intellectual faculties, and the intellectual faculties to the ultimate ruler of all things, which is God. Second, what was lost by sin was not part of man's nature as being natural to him, for even the angels kept their natural faculties after the fall. Therefore, since immediately post-fall, in Adam and Eve's shame of their nakedness, we see in themselves, and even up to today, that our passions and desires are at odds with reason, then we must conclude that this original integrity or subjection of the sensual appetite to the mind was not due to nature, but by a supernatural gift. Therefore, man must have been created in a state of gift, a state of grace. Article 2, whether passions existed in the soul of the first man. What we mean by passions is more or less what we mean today by emotions, which are elicited in us. For example, when I see the pizza, elicited in me is the passion of desire. Or when I think about the possibility of getting to heaven, elicited in me is the passion of hope. Now, these passions follow upon our nature as animals, since we see these emotions are common to us as well as to irrational animals like the dog. So the passions must have existed in the first man as they exist in us today, but they would have existed in Adam and Eve in an integrated and subjected to reason kind of way. However, they would have been missing those passions whose object is evil, such as fear or sorrow. As far as feeling those passions, as Aquinas writes, Adam had no passion with evil as its object, such as fear, sorrow, and the like. Neither had he passions in respect of good not possessed, but to be possessed then as burning concupiscence. But those passions which regard present good, as joy and love, or which regard future good to be had at a proper time, as desire and hope, that casteth not down, existed in the state of innocence. Article 3, whether Adam had all the virtues. What is virtue? Aquinas gives a shorthand definition in this article, saying, the virtues are nothing but those perfections whereby reason is directed to God, and the inferior powers regulated according to the dictate of reason, as will be explained in the treatise on the virtues. Also, the Gilby Summa gives a definition of virtue, which is a good habit in the following definition on habits, which is a stable condition, whether acquired or given, which enables a faculty the better to go about its proper business, or even a bad habit to go about it badly. With these definitions in mind, we return to our article where Aquinas responds. The rectitude of the primitive state required that man should, in a sense, possess every virtue. Some of these virtues Adam could have had, but without carrying out the act corresponding to them, such as those virtues which come to act when there is sorrow or evil in the world, like the virtue of penance or the virtue of mercy. Adam would have also had what Aquinas calls imperfect supernatural virtues, such as faith and hope, along with their corresponding acts. which he would have had to have because he was called from the beginning to a supernatural end or goal. These virtues are called imperfect simply because they fall short of the vision and attainment we will have, God willing, in the beatific vision when these virtues are no longer necessary. But as to all the other virtues, whether natural or supernatural, if they implied no imperfection in the essence of them, Adam would have possessed them as habits and would be able to carry out, therefore, their corresponding acts as well. Article 4, whether the actions of the first man were less meritorious than ours. It's a good question because we normally take an action to be more praiseworthy or deserving of reward if it was more difficult for the doer to do. For example, we praise the underdog who wasn't supposed to win and then barely won, normally more so than the defending champion who wins all the time and effortlessly. So were Adam's good actions more praiseworthy than our own today? Because due to his original integrity, his virtues, and grace, his good actions would have, in a sense, been easier to perform. Aquinas says, even with that being the case, Adam's acts still would have been more meritorious or deserving of reward than ours currently, and he argues for that from the basis of the essential factor of supernatural merit. Works are supernaturally meritorious based on our friendship with God, which is a supernatural gift itself and a kind of divinization, as well as our love of God, the two of which are combined in that one supernatural virtue we call charity. And since Adam's charity would have been, according to Aquinas, more copious as meeting with no obstacle in human nature, then it follows his acts would have been more meritorious. Then to question 96 on the mastership belonging to man in the state of innocence, Article 1, whether Adam in the state of innocence had mastership over the animals. Did man rule over the animals in the beginning? And Scripture seems to imply that man did, as it is written in Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." St. Thomas then gives a rational defense of the mastership of man, beginning by saying, "Now all animals are naturally subject to man." This can be proved in three ways. The first of Aquinas' ways comes from the philosophical axiom that the lesser exists for the greater, which we see demonstrated, for example, in that plants are consumed by animals, which are a better kind of thing than plants, and we consume both plants and animals since we are the best kind of thing down here. The second reason St. Thomas will give is based on the execution of the divine government, in which the inferior is governed by the superior. We see that in the hierarchy of angels. We see that in the material world, in political establishments of kings or parliaments, as well as in the family between adults and their children. And so, too, one would expect something of the like between man and the irrational beasts. Thirdly, Aquinas argues from the difference between the participated and the essential. In any category, for example, we have a participated and limited being, but God is essential being, and therefore it is natural for us to be subordinated and subject to God. In the same way, animals have a kind of prudence or instinctual knowledge of how to act, but we have an intellectual, farther expanding understanding of how to act rightly and to govern rightly, and so it is fitting for irrational animals, which have a limited pseudo-prudence, to be subordinated to our more comprehensive intellectual prudence. Lastly, and very interestingly, Aquinas tells us how he thinks this kind of subordination would have worked out in the beginning. He writes, "All animals by their natural instinct have a certain participation of prudence and reason, which accounts for the fact that cranes follow their leader and bees obey their queen. So all animals would have obeyed man of their own accord, as in the present state some domestic animals obey him." Article 2, whether man had mastership over all other creatures. This article is inquiring into how man would have had mastership over those living things which cannot take orders or be domesticated like the tree or the grass. St. Thomas answers this article in a sentence. He says, "In the state of innocence, man had mastership over the animals by commanding them. But of the natural powers and the body itself, man is master not by commanding, but by using them. Thus also in the state of innocence, man's mastership over plants and inanimate things consisted not in commanding or in charging them, but in making use of them without hindrance." Article 3, whether men were equal in the state of innocence. St. Thomas begins by saying, "The things which are of God are well ordered, but order chiefly consists in inequality. For Augustine says, order disposes things equal and unequal in their proper place. Therefore, in the primitive state, which was most proper and orderly, inequality would have existed. In the primitive state of man, and if that state had continued, there still would have been order in the family, just as we see today, which would mean differing degrees of authority or inequality of authority. There also would have been differing degrees of knowledge and virtue from the older or more practiced who would have likely been placed over to instruct the younger and less knowledgeable or less virtuous. There also would have been differing degrees of physical strength and beauty, depending, again, on the effects of the environment, the application of the body to that environment. But even with these varying degrees of perfection in men and women, there would have been, according to Aquinas, no fault or defect in man, either in regard to his body or his soul. And to our last article, Article 4, whether in the state of innocence man would have been master over man, St. Thomas responds, "The condition of man in the state of innocence was not more exalted than the condition of the angels, but among the angels some rule over others, and so one order is called that of dominions. Therefore it was not beneath the dignity of the state of innocence that one man should be subject to another." Then he explains there are two kinds of mastership or governing another. One is the kind of mastership we call slavery. That would be to use another person like we use a tool, not for the tool's benefit, but for our own benefit. And Aquinas says this is clearly an evil, which would not have existed in the state of innocence. Another kind of governance is one in which the governor directs others towards their own good, or in regards to the good of the whole. And this kind of mastership would have existed in the very beginning, because since humans naturally live in community, and community cannot exist without unity, therefore there would need to be some unifying head of that community to direct it in such a way as befits the common good, or that good applicable to all. Also, since there would be superiority of age and superiority of talents and knowledge, it's fitting that the smarter and more virtuous would be placed above the less intelligent, the less virtuous, so as to raise them up as much as possible to their very own perfection. Therefore, for these reasons, even in the state of innocence, there would have existed mastership of man over man. And that is all for questions 95 and 96 of the Prima Pars, that is, of things pertaining to the first man's will, namely grace and righteousness, and of the mastership belonging to man in the state of innocence. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.